Hello and welcome back to Era 5 of APUS History. In today's video, we will be looking at topic 5.9, the government policies during the Civil War, and we will be specifically examining how Lincoln's leadership impacted American ideals over the course of the war. So let's get to it. Lincoln's stated purpose for fighting the war at the beginning was to preserve the Union. He insisted that he had no legal right to interfere with slavery in the states where it existed, and he had no inclination to do so, even promising as such, as late as his inauguration in March of 1861. Still, that hadn't prevented the first 7 Southern states from seceding. Many Southerners accused Lincoln of being just as much of a tyrant as George III, particularly when he suspended the right of habeas corpus, the right to know why you are being held and to appear in court to face those charges. But his right to do so was explicitly a part of the U.S. Constitution, which states in Article 1, Section 9, "The privilege of the writ of habeas corpus shall not be suspended, unless when in cases of rebellion or invasion the public safety may require it." Part of the controversy stemmed from the fact that this was part of the powers of Congress, and Lincoln issued his suspension as an executive order to his military commanders, though Congress was in recess and unavailable to act at that time. One planter who was arrested under these orders challenged his detention, and Chief Justice Roger Taney issued a ruling saying that the power only rested with Congress. But both Lincoln and the military ignored his ruling in Ex parte Merryman, which was issued by Taney acting as a circuit court judge, as all Supreme Court justices did at that time, and not by the Supreme Court itself. Congress tried to pass its own authorization supporting Lincoln once they were back in session, but failed until early 1863, when Congress finally did pass a general suspension of habeas corpus throughout the whole U.S. The justification for doing so in the first place was to arrest those suspected of helping the Confederates or disrupting the recruitment and supply of the military as they gathered to respond to the crisis. During the Civil War, the Confederacy was essentially dependent on the cotton trade with Britain and France, and they thought that Britain in particular's supposed dependence on King Cotton would lead to not only the diplomatic recognition of the Confederacy, but also military intervention on their behalf. But due to popular demand, cotton imports were stopped in the spring of 1861. The elites of British society tended to support the Confederacy since it emulated the hierarchy of the aristocracy and landed gentry, whereas the middle and working classes in Britain tended to favor the Union, although honestly the majority didn't express an opinion one way or the other. Some British arms companies did trade with the Confederacy, often for cotton rather than cash, but the blockade of the Confederate coastline, known as the Anaconda Plan, made that increasingly difficult. To counter that, some shipyards in Britain built blockade runners, fast steamships with a shallow draft that could sneak through and outrun the Union blockade and bring in vital supplies to the Confederacy. In addition, commerce raiders, ships that were designed to attack Union merchant shipping so as to draw naval ships away from the blockade, were also built in British and Scottish shipyards. These ships sank or damaged millions of dollars worth of merchant goods, even leading the U.S. to demand payment of reparations from Britain for the losses incurred under various international maritime laws. The Confederacy ultimately hoped that they could get Britain to do even more, perhaps even officially side with them and declare war on the Union. But once Lincoln issued the Emancipation Proclamation and made ending slavery an objective of the war, intervention on behalf of the Confederacy was very unpopular and never happened. Of course, there was also other issues in Europe going on that had Britain's attention, but still, they declined to get involved. Another policy of the U.S. government under Abraham Lincoln was the recruitment of soldiers for the U.S. military. When the war began, the U.S. had only about 16,000 total soldiers, which is why Lincoln had put out a call for 75,000 volunteers to serve for 3 months after the attack on Fort Sumter. He had to actively increase the size of the military, but Black Americans were actively banned from enlisting. Lincoln believed allowing their enlistment would anger Northern whites and alienate not just the Southern states, but also the border states that he was trying to keep in the Union. Well, many Black Americans volunteered as cooks, nurses, and some states raised volunteer regiments of Black soldiers as well. By late 1862, Lincoln changed his mind and authorized the recruitment of Black soldiers, most of whom were free Blacks from the northern states, although some former slaves joined the ranks of the Union Army as well. The most famous of these Black regiments being the 54th Massachusetts Infantry, that fought in several key engagements along the Georgia and South Carolina coast. Eventually, more than 200,000 Black soldiers served in the Union Army. The Navy, on the other hand, had always allowed Black sailors to enlist, and crews were racially integrated. In addition, unlike the Army, the Navy also paid equal wages to white and Black sailors, although officer positions were still almost impossible for Black sailors to obtain. Another strategy for increasing the size of the Union Army was to resort to a draft. The Civil War Conscription Act, also known as the Enrollment Act, was the first wartime draft in U.S. history. It required the registration of all male citizens ages 20 to 45, including immigrants who intended to become citizens. But it also allowed for wealthy people to pay $300 to get out of the draft or to find a substitute to serve on their behalf. And so this war became known as a rich man's war, but a poor man's fight, highlighting the class issues that were beginning to happen as well. This exemption clause led to riots in major cities, some so intense, like the one in New York City, that the Union Army had to come into the cities to put down these riots. In the aftermath of the Battle of Gettysburg, a local cemetery initially decided to create an annex to bury the remains of soldiers killed in the battle. It was quickly turned into a national cemetery, funded by the states as a whole. In November of 1863, a dedication ceremony of this new cemetery was planned. Noted statesman Edward Everett gave a nearly 2-hour speech that described the Battle of Gettysburg and its related events, connecting it to earlier wars and events as well. Abraham Lincoln was then invited to give a few appropriate remarks for the occasion. Just 271 words, Lincoln reframed the meaning of the war and depicted the struggle against slavery as the fulfillment of America's foundational ideals. Here are his words. 77 years ago, our fathers brought forth on this continent a new nation, conceived in liberty and dedicated to the proposition that all men are created equal. Now we are engaged in a great civil war, testing whether that nation, or any nation so conceived and so dedicated, can long endure. We are met on a great battlefield of that war. We have come to dedicate a portion of that field as a final resting place for those who here gave their lives that that nation might live. It is altogether fitting and proper that we should do this. But in a larger sense, we cannot dedicate, we cannot consecrate, we cannot hallow this ground. The brave men, living and dead, who struggled here have consecrated it far above our poor power to add or detract. The world will little note nor long remember what we say here, but it can never forget what they did here. It is for us, the living, rather, to be dedicated here to the unfinished work which they who fought here have thus far so nobly advanced. It is rather for us to be here dedicated to the great task remaining before us, that from these honored dead we take increased devotion to that cause for which they gave the last full measure of devotion, that we here highly resolve that these dead shall not have died in vain, that this nation under God shall have a new birth of freedom, and that the government of the people, by the people, for the people, shall not perish from the earth. Everett later praised the president for his eloquent and concise speech, saying, "I should be glad if I could flatter myself that I came as near to the central idea of the occasion in 2 hours as you did in 2 minutes." Lincoln was pleased, having thought that perhaps his speech had been a total failure. Lincoln had hoped to reunite the nation, but it was still bitterly divided. And this was going into the re-election season. Lincoln faced criticism for his handling of civil liberties, for how long the war was taking, for his emancipation policies, and for the beginning of his plan to readmit former Confederate states to the Union, so it was far from certain that he would win re-election. Republicans and war Democrats, those within the Democratic Party who supported continuing the war until it was won, rather than giving in to the South and ending the war, they combined to form the National Union Party. And although they did renominate Lincoln, they chose Andrew Johnson, a war Democrat from Tennessee, as his running mate to broaden his appeal to other war Democrats. The Democratic Party was bitterly split between the war Democrats and the peace Democrats, with the more radical peace Democrats nicknamed the Copperheads. Since they were so divided, they actually compromised by nominating a pro-war presidential candidate, George McClellan, and an anti-war vice presidential candidate. His name was George Pendleton, if you really must know. And officially, the party supported a platform of advocating peace, although their candidate, McClellan, didn't actually agree with it. The overall election actually turned out to be closer than it appears on the electoral map. Lincoln won about 55% of the popular votes, but as you can see, the Electoral College vote was overwhelming. He won there 212 to 21. At his second inauguration, Lincoln used his speech to the assembled crowd to reflect on the meaning of the war and to speculate on the purposes of God to help reunite the country. He called the waning conflict a divine judgment on both sides of the war. He believed that a common memory of the war and its impact on slavery, with God as a key player, would help the country move beyond their disagreements. And he concluded his remarks that day, saying, "With malice towards none, with charity for all, with firmness in the right as God gives us to see the right, let us strive on to finish the work we are in, to bind up the nation's wounds, to care for him who shall have borne the battle, and for his widow and his orphan, to do all which may achieve and cherish a just and lasting peace among ourselves and with all nations." This also sought to help shape America's view of its place in the larger world. And finally, just 42 days after that second inauguration, Abraham Lincoln decided to take a short break from the difficulties of leadership, which was much easier for him to do at that time since Robert E. Lee had surrendered his troops at Appomattox just days earlier. So Lincoln visited Ford's Theater in Washington, D.C., taking his wife to see the play Our American Cousin. Initially, Ulysses S. Grant was to attend with the president, but his plans changed, and he had instead taken a train home. John Wilkes Booth, a well-known actor admired by the president, hoped to revive the Confederate cause. He bribed the guard and snuck into the president's box, where he shot him with a small handgun at a moment in the play when the audience would be laughing at a particular line. Booth then leapt onto the stage, shouting something to the audience. There is disagreement about what exactly he said, but the traditional reports say he yelled, "Sic semper tyrannis," thus always to tyrants. Though injured in his leap onto the stage, Booth made it to his horse and fled into the Maryland countryside, where he remained in hiding until he could cross over to Virginia, expecting a hero's welcome. But he did not receive one. He would instead be tracked down and eventually cornered in a barn, where he was shot and killed. The investigation into his activities revealed a larger plot that included a plan to assassinate Vice President Johnson, Secretary of State William Seward, and even General Grant. Johnson's assassin failed to act. Seward's supposed assassin did manage to get into his home, attacking him, but bandages and braces from a carriage accident a couple of weeks earlier had actually saved his life. And then, of course, Grant had left town and was therefore out of reach. As for Lincoln, the bullet entered his head just behind his left ear, tore through his brain, and lodged behind his right eye. All the doctors agreed the injury was mortal. Lincoln was brought to a nearby boarding house, where he died early the next morning. In death, he was mourned by both the North and the South. A special funeral train carried his body on a meandering path back to his home for burial in Springfield, Illinois. Hundreds of thousands of people turned out on this procession to say goodbye to their president. Most of Booth's co-conspirators would be arrested within a month. 8 were tried before a military tribunal, and all were found guilty, including the doctor that fixed Booth's broken leg after he escaped. 4 were sentenced to death and hanged. Though Lincoln's death united the nation in their collective grief, it also increased the bitterness of the North towards the South and resulted in tougher treatment during Reconstruction under President Johnson. But we'll talk more about that in the next topic video. Well, that's what you need to know about topic 5.9, the government policies during the Civil War. Be sure to keep up with your reading, and I'll catch you in the next video.